Today on Market Journal, we'll talk trade, weather, and what's ahead in the livestock market for the last quarter of 2018. Our market analyst will weigh in. Plus, shut the door and forget it, right? Not so fast. Before you store that grain, hear what our expert has to say. And are you jealous of your neighbor's biomass? Well, the secret is in the soil. We'll give you some tips on what to look for. And the Nebraska LEAD Program has spent almost 4 decades developing ag leaders. We'll introduce you to the newest class and hear why they think the program will help put them in a position to succeed. This week's edition of Market Journal starts right now.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hey everybody, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. It's been a cold and dreary week for most of the state, but that's not stopping us. Lots to get to on this week's edition of the show. Let's jump right in. Before we sit down with this week's market analyst, I want to take a quick look at the crop and harvest numbers. The USDA says the corn crop is 34% harvested. That's up 8% from last week and up from the pace of 21% this time last year. Missouri, North Carolina, and my home state of Tennessee are the closest to being finished with harvest. For soybeans, harvest is at 32%, 91% of the crop is dropping leaves. Lots of news in the livestock market too. Our market analyst this week is Dr. Derrell Peel. He's an agricultural economist from Oklahoma State University. Thanks for being here, Derrell.
Happy to be here.
Starting off, I'd like to get your take on the new deal that will replace NAFTA. Now, for those watching who aren't familiar, could you tell us the nuts and bolts of this deal and what it ultimately means for farmers and livestock producers?
Well, you know, this is an important deal. I think the biggest contribution of this is simply to get back to NAFTA to a large extent. You know, we're most concerned, I think, generally in agricultural about preserving what we had before. We got that back. It does go a little farther than that. So dairy markets and a little bit in poultry and egg markets, there's a little bit of increased access. There's a few other things. There's a little bit of change in some wheat grading and some other things. But by and large, I think the biggest contribution of this is just the certainty that comes from having a deal in place and having essentially the same deal we had before.
And yeah, of course, Canada being a big part of that deal, and you were quoted in a recent article talking about how Canada's drought has really opened up the market for U.S. producers. Could you give us a breakdown on that?
Well, you know, Canada has experienced drought issues in the western part where the bulk of the cattle are this year, much as parts of the U.S. have. And so, you know, I think the impacts on the Canadian market have been largely, I would call them, you know, mostly management headaches, some feed shortages, hay prices are higher. They've had to move some cattle around, no doubt. I think from a broader market standpoint, it probably hasn't had a huge impact in terms of a lot of additional liquidation. Perhaps it tempered some of their, you know, some of their herd growth a little bit. Canadian cattle numbers were down a little bit as of July 1 this year, the beef cow herd specifically. I don't know that this was the major part of that, but it probably played into that to some extent.
And weather right here at home, also a big story with Hurricane Michael, massive storm. Do you see that causing any disruptions to the market?
It'll have some impacts as far as beef markets or maybe meat markets more broadly. I think, you know, there's sort of two issues. What does it do to the supply side? What does it do to the demand side? I don't think the supply side impacts will be huge, especially for beef, unless we get into something really unusual. cattle were to get caught and drowned or something, but the numbers would still be relatively small. So I don't see that as an issue. On the demand side, clearly these things cause massive disruptions for a period of time in restaurant business in those affected areas. Some of the meat trade, obviously flow of products. So it does have some demand impacts. It's going to have bigger impacts in general in other markets. And, you look at the southern crops that are, for the most part, not very much harvested yet, cotton and peanuts and to some extent soybeans. Those markets will be more impacted. I think, again, it's probably just a very short run phenomenon for meat markets in general.
We're into the final quarter of 2018. What's your take on the current state of the U.S. cattle market, and what predictions do you have heading into 2019?
We've continued in 2018, much like we did in 2017 in a general sense with, increasing beef production, still growing cattle numbers. So you've got supply pressure there, and yet prices have held relatively well. In fact, they've held very strongly. Demand has been good, both domestic and international. And so as we finish out 2018 here, we're going to continue that. We've got fed cattle and feeder cattle prices, for the most part, at or above year-ago levels. And so now the feeder cattle, maybe the lightweights are going to be a little bit down from last year because we had such a strong fourth quarter last year. But by and large, we're in good shape finishing that out. Going into 2019, we're going to continue to see modest increases in production. The pipeline is still full of feeder cattle. Even if we stop this herd growth going into 2019, potentially, we're still going to see more beef production in 2019. So we're still focused on demand. Both domestic and international demand are key to working through these larger supplies. The trade data continues to show that we've had a stellar performance in terms of beef exports, and that has really helped out the market a lot.
And I know that marketing, risk management, two of your main specialties. What are some of the main questions that farmers have been asking you this time of year, and what do you tell them?
Well, here in the Southern Plains, we're looking at wheat pasture this time of the year. It's always a trick to get it produced in the first place, and we've had lots of rain, and we've got some pretty good wheat pasture underway, and in fact, it's going to be grazable in the near future. So I'm getting lots of questions, working through those projected budgets for winter grazing. Those prospects, by and large, have looked fairly attractive this year as well. So producers are talking about, doing that, what kinds of risk management they can put on those calves for the spring markets, those kinds of things. And in general, I think producers are keeping a handle on this, on the herd growth and kind of what our prospects are, not only for 2019 but beyond. And so we're looking at, herd growth appears to be slowing here in 2018. It may peak as of this next January, or it might grow slightly again next year and then perhaps peak in January of 2020. So they're watching that from a longer term perspective to see if we can kind of top out here and not necessarily get into a situation where we, cyclically push prices lower and get back into that cyclical liquidation that we have so often done in the past. We actually seem to have some prospects this year to have what I'm calling a soft landing, kind of by sort of plateauing these numbers, holding them relatively stable, and all of that depends on demand continuing to be a very strong factor.
And finally, with the new farm bill in limbo, do you see the livestock market feeling any effects from that?
Well, I think the livestock market impacts are, as they typically are with a farm bill, are less, less significant, perhaps less, timely in some sense, or time sensitive. There are some things in the farm bill that will be important. There are some tweaks to some of the forage risk protection and livestock indemnity protection programs that may be important to producers. There's also obviously some animal health related things, funding for the disease or for the vaccine bank, for FMD, those kinds of things that the industry has a very keen interest in as we go forward. And so there are some important things. I don't know that from a day-to-day program standpoint there's a lot that the beef industry is concerned about at the moment, but clearly looking at those longer-term program components.
Dr. Derrell Peel, we always appreciate your insight. Thanks for being here with us today.
I'm very happy to do it anytime.
You probably noticed Derrell was in a nice looking field out there, and what's below the ground plays a role in making what's above the ground the best it can be. Market Journal's Maddie McIntosh has that story.
While farmers may be savvy about what grows above ground, they may not be too knowledgeable about what's going on underneath the earth. That's why Paul Jasa uses the soil health workshops and field labs to help teach growers what good soil consists of.
Basically, we're calling it a carbon workshop. A lot of producers out there have looked at their crops in the field. They see what's going on above ground. We want them to look below ground, look and see what's going on in the soil itself, the microbes, everything that's going on as far as nutrient exchange, gas exchange, and that looking into the soil is something that people haven't done, but as they start learning about it, they learn how important it is to have a good, healthy soil. Well, when it comes to soil, we want to have a good, healthy soil that's living. We're learning as we get a healthier soil system, the soil can do a lot more for us. And again, that's why we're trying to educate farmers about that. Farmers are excellent mechanics, excellent agronomists above ground, like I say, but below ground they haven't really looked that much. And so they're learning more about it. They have to be competitive now.
As times and methods change, it can become more difficult for soil to retain its nutrients. This can make maintaining a healthy living soil a challenge.
We, unfortunately, and I say we as our ancestors, we took Mother Nature's permanent vegetation of grasslands here in Nebraska and plowed it up, and we plant corn or soybeans or wheat and have an active root only growing about 5 months a year in the soil. Well, Mother Nature had an active root in the soil year round, maybe actively growing only about 8, 9, 10 months depending upon the winter. But when it comes to feeding the soil system, that active root exudes carbon into the soil to feed the microbes. And same thing as we had livestock in the yard, we wouldn't feed them only 5 months in the summer, we feed them year round. I want to feed my soil livestock year round. Well, it turns out when we're feeding the soil, we are actually get that living root there. Now all of a sudden we're taking away some water and nutrients potentially from the corn. But the healthier soil helps provide that for the next crop because it cycles what's there in Mother Nature. And I say Mother Nature never put fertilizer out there, and Mother Nature didn't do irrigation. Mother Nature always had something growing there, but it's a diverse mix of things, not a monoculture. And so that's one of the things we're trying to do is tell farmers about how we want diversity in the soil.
One way farmers can take care of their soil health is by being more attentive to the crops or biomass they grow above it. Farmers should also have reasoning behind the types of seeds they sow.
Well, biomass is what we actually grow. And we got to start thinking about why we're growing it. If I'm doing it to feed soil, I don't need a lot of biomass above ground because it's the roots below ground that's feeding the soil system. Now, if I'm feeding livestock, if I want to get a good steak, I need some biomass for that cattle to eat. And so again, what are we producing? And it makes a big difference where we're located in the state. If we got plenty of rainfall or irrigation, I can raise a lot more biomass because it's going to take water. But if I'm looking at just protecting the soil, keeping the sun and wind off the soil surface, and I'm looking at getting a living root in the soil, maybe I'm going to use a real low water use cover crop and not use much water, not grow much biomass, but I still get the objective of feeding the soil and protecting the soil. So the biomass, too many people get hung up on raising a bunch of biomass. No, what's the function of your biomass? Why are you doing it? The important thing is I tell farmers they have to decide up front when they're planting a cover crop or even planting any crop, what is their final goal. If I'm just going to feed the soil and protect the soil, I can put out half the seeding rate compared to the farmer who wants to feed animals because he's going to need more seeds, more plants growing because he needs to produce more. And again, there's a relationship, the more he produces, the more water it's going to take. Well, his reward is the livestock. For a crop producer who's growing a cover crop, maybe his reward is healthier soil to pass on to his future generations. There, the biomass isn't near as critical as the living root.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
All right, some really good information there. Okay, so your soil is in good shape and now you've been harvesting. If so, you're probably also working to keep any excess grain stored in the proper way. I spoke with Dr. Ken Hellevang, who is an agricultural engineer with North Dakota State University Extension. He tells us there are some important general rules to follow, and that begins with keeping the grain dry and at the proper temperature.
Yes, those are the two key points with grain storage at any time or under any condition is finding the appropriate moisture content to store the grain for whatever period of time we're storing, and then controlling the temperature. And controlling the temperature is a critical piece. It's just as important as the moisture content.
And how often is the grain going to need to be checked, and what should a farmer be looking for when they do check it?
My recommendation on checking the stored grain is to do it at least every 2 weeks initially. Once we've gone through all the cool down, once we know what the history is of that stored grain, once we're at winter storage temperatures, then we can probably stretch that out to 3, maybe even 4 weeks during the coldest part of the winter. But then starting late winter, we should be going back to every 2 weeks. There's just so much that can change in our stored grain within a 2-week or 3-week time frame.
So if you follow all the rules, take all the precautions, is there a maximum time that you're going to be able to store the grain, or is it eventually going to go bad?
If you store the grain properly and manage it properly, we can store long term. But there's a lot of details that need to be taken into consideration. If we think of corn, we can store 15% moisture corn over winter, but if we're going into storing during the summer months, warmer spring temperatures, we really need to be thinking of 13 to 14% moisture. Same thing with soybeans. We can store 13% moisture soybeans over winter, but anything that's going into spring and into summer temperatures really needs to be down closer to 11%. And with soybeans, controlling that temperature is even more critical than it is with corn. We have oil that the quality is impacted with warmer temperatures. So the goal going through spring and into summer should be to keep it as cool as we can.
And I know that you've written a lot on this topic. I would assume you're probably not a huge fan of storing grain outside. Would I be correct in that?
That would be very correct.
And why is that exactly?
And the example that I typically use is that if we have an uncovered pile and we get just a 1-inch rain on that pile, if we were to concentrate the moisture into the top foot, we're looking at increasing the moisture content by 9 percentage points. So again, using corn as an example, we're going from 15 up to 24% moisture, and we're going to have spoilage at that moisture content. I rarely see an outdoor pile where we don't end up with 2 to 3 feet of spoiled grain in the top portion. Now, if we cover the pile with an appropriate tarp or cover, we aerate that pile to control the temperature, we have dry grain going into storage, then we can store in a pile outdoors. Same thing is true with the grain bags. If the grain is dry going into storage, particularly with corn, we can store that into the next summer as long as we're at roughly 13% moisture. We also want to run those bags north-south so we get even solar radiation on that pile or on that tube. Soybeans, I really discourage people from storing into the next spring and summer because we have no way of controlling that temperature.
We'll have part 2 of our interview with Dr. Hellevang next week. Moving on now, and since 1981, one program has been in the business of turning agriculture professionals into the leaders of tomorrow. It even says so in its name, the Nebraska LEAD Program. The latest class recently got underway, so I went to learn more about the program and hear how it's going to help students in achieving the goals they want for themselves and their communities. For these 29 Nebraskans, the nerves are reminiscent of the first day of school. They come from seemingly every facet of the state's agricultural industry to begin a 2-year journey. And during that time, they'll encounter both challenges and new opportunities. The Nebraska Leadership Education Action Development Program, or LEAD for short, is now in its 38th year. It's a 2-year program open to people between the ages of 25 and 55 who are involved in the agribusiness and production side of agriculture.
The first year, the participants study local, state, and national issues. The first year also includes 10 days to Kansas City, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. And then the second year study builds on that first year study and includes a 14 to 16-day international study travel seminar.
Over the course of the program, the group will spend time focusing on ag policy, leadership training, global issues, business and marketing, and the latest advancements in agriculture. According to Terry, the curriculum and accessibility to other leaders in the field sets this program apart.
I think what they'll get is we basically fast track them. You know, they're going to be bombarded with a lot of things, a lot of issues, all sides of the issues. The communication skills are so important. You know, they're going to not only become good speakers, they're going to be better listeners, and leaders need to be listeners. And the networking, not only within their class, the expertise that's within their class, but the LEAD alums, 1,055 strong across Nebraska and beyond, but then the many speakers and presenters that we visit with both throughout Nebraska, our national seminar and our international seminar. These are experts they can rely on to help them make the right decisions.
Heather Ramsey works as an independent grain advisor. She's had friends and clients who went through the program and found it to be a life-changing experience. After thinking about it for a few years, she decided there's no time like the present.
I'm a boss, a mom, a wife, and trying to make that work seemed like a struggle. At some point you just have to say, I'm going to do this. There's never really a right time, but I'm going to do this because it's going to better me professionally and personally. And so that's kind of how we got to this decision. I have a really great spouse who supports this and is helping out a lot, even through harvest and the busy time of year that we start.
When it comes time to select a new class, the state is divided into 5 areas. 6 people are chosen from each spot, which allows for lots of diversity and a sharing of ideas. Boone McAfee works for the Nebraska Corn Board and is eager to learn from others and work to grow stronger together.
We have producers who produce organic, produce conventional. We have some who are involved in agribusiness. Some are raising bison. One is an agronomist for the hops industry. So just a lot of diversity that we don't think of in Nebraska, and looking forward to learning from them and learning from their experiences.
Nebraska is so diverse in our agriculture, diverse in the cultures of our people, the way things are done in each part of the state. So to be an effective leader for Nebraska agriculture, our participants need to have a good understanding of all areas of Nebraska.
And with that agricultural know-how in their back pocket, LEAD graduates are able to share what they've learned in their community, be it large, small, rural, or urban.
So I just think it's a vastly important program for the people in the state of Nebraska. They bring a lot of knowledge to the individual, and then that individual brings a lot of knowledge back to the home area, back to the community, the family, everything like that.
They make a difference. And you know, yes, we've had several state senators, several commodity board directors, several board members on commodities, NRDs, a United States senator, a Board of Regents member. You know, those people have parlayed their experience into those positions, but the key is the people go back and serve their communities, make their community a better place to live, work, and play.
The deadline for entries for the next class is June 15th of 2019. Al Dutcher is here now with weather, and Al, much of the state dealt with rain earlier this week, even a few snowflakes in some spots. What can we expect for the week ahead?
Well, Troy, you're exactly right. We have seen a wild week of weather, lots of heavy precipitation, accumulating snowfall. I think most of the producers out there would like to take a big, long stretch of dry weather so we can get some harvesting done, and we'll get to that in a second because it does look like a much better forecast, at least for harvest activity. But as a recap, the heaviest of the precipitation for this entire storm occurred across the southeastern corner of the state. We have total from numerous stations in the 4 to 6 inch range, and then to the northwest of there, basically all the way out to the Panhandle, most locations reported anywhere from 1 to up to 3 inches of precipitation. There was a couple isolated pockets a little bit more than that. And then, of course, with the snowfall accumulations, we've seen, at least from the early reports, 4 to 5 inches in the Kilgore and the Ellsworth area. Outside of that, most totals were in the 1 to 3 inch range, although when we get our co-op data in at the end of the month, I expect we'll see some more isolated totals that will be in that 4 to 5 inch range also. The big loser in terms of precipitation was the northwestern panhandle, where precipitation totals were essentially in that 1/4 to a 1/2 inch range, so a lot less moisture in that region. So as we go forward in time, what we have presently is this cold air that came in with this trough over the northern plains will start to move toward the Great Lakes region. We do have some moisture from Sergio that is going to make its way up into the southern plains for this weekend. So the big question is, how far north will that go? So we're looking at low pressure across Texas. Here's the heavy precipitation with the remnants of what was Sergio, and that will move off toward the east, maybe clipping southeast Nebraska this evening and this overnight hours, but we also have high pressure pushing in, so hopefully that will push most of our moisture toward the south and east and leave us fairly high and dry. We do get a little bit of residual moisture up into the central Rockies, but the main flow stays to our south, and then that will push off into the eastern United States as another big shot of cold air comes down the pipeline. So we're looking at hard freeze conditions most likely Sunday morning and Monday morning into the growing season for those that haven't had it, but the main precipitation will continue to remain to the south of us as we go through Monday. And then as we get into Tuesday, we start to see this ridge building in. This is a sign of better things to come as the trough parks itself over the Great Lakes. High pressure firmly in place across all the Rocky Mountain region, and that will push toward the east as the week progresses. The main heavy precipitation now shifts toward the southeast and the eastern seaboard. As this trough in the upper atmosphere, by the time we get to Wednesday, starts lifting off into the northeast. We get much warmer conditions building into our region, and we return to slightly below normal, but very dry conditions in terms of high pressure. Cool Canadian dry air will help to take some of the moisture out of the crops that are in the fields right now. Heavy precipitation moves off the eastern seaboard, and then we see that ridge building even farther toward the east as we get on Thursday. We do show, at least the models, a surface low in western Nebraska, but there is no moisture to speak of for this system, so a few clouds is about all we can expect. And look at the dry pattern from west coast to east coast. And then on Friday, we do see some evidence of another system trying to move into the southwest, but once again, that looks like it's going to take the south as high pressure very firmly in control. So a very good opportunity for harvest activity weather, and that will continue as we go through the remainder of the month. In fact, looking at the models, that goes to about the 27th before we start to see any significant moisture returning back to the western Corn Belt. 8 to 14-day forecast takes into consideration that warming trend coming into our region, and in terms of precipitation, a very dry trend across the entire Corn Belt. So Troy, looks like better weather for harvesting coming up.
Thanks, Al. That's our show for this week, but we hope to see you right back here next time. Until then, I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.